Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. If you knit for someone who is hard on their socks, or if you're just wanting to extend the life of your hand knit socks, this replaceable sock heel technique might be just up your alley. In this video, I'll demonstrate one of several approaches that can be used to knit a replaceable heel flap and heel turn. At the end of the video, I'll offer suggestions and resources for other approaches and tell you a bit about the origins of this replaceable heel concept. So the heel flap is worked in a way that might be identical to how some of you knit your heel flaps. It's slightly different from how I would normally knit my heel flap. So what we're going to do is, I'm at the beginning of a round, I've finished my sock leg. I'm going to start working my heel flap. I'm using magic loop. You could use double pointed needles, 2 circulars, flexi flips, whatever you like. We're going to be working the heel flap across half of the stitches. So I have a 64 stitch sock, so I've got 32 stitches for my heel flap. So for the first row, we're just going to knit across all of those stitches in plain stockinette. We're not slipping a stitch, we're just knitting across. Okay, so we worked across all of the stitches. Now we're going to turn, because we've stopped working in the round. We're going to be working back and forth. Now we're going to actually begin the stitch pattern that we're going to be using for the rest of the heel flap. And that is that on the wrong side rows, we're going to work the selvages as garter stitches. So we're going to knit the first and last stitch of every row. We are not slipping these stitches as you may be used to when you are doing a heel flap in Gusset. Now you do have a choice. You could work more than one stitch in garter stitch at each end. There's some good reasons why you might want to do that. So I'm actually going to do that myself. I'm going to knit the first 3 stitches and the last 3 stitches in garter stitch. And then the rest will be purled. You don't have to do that. You could just do the first and last stitch, but do at least those. So now I've gotten to the last 3 stitches. I'm going to knit all 3 of these. Now, for the right side rows, we're going to knit the first and last 3 stitches to maintain our garter stitch, but then we're going to be working a slip stitch pattern in between. This slip stitch pattern is often called heel stitch. So we're going to work the first 3 stitches, or however many stitches you have decided to use to work in garter stitch. They're going to be knit. Now we're going to start the slip stitch pattern. So we keep the yarn in back. We're going to slip as if to purl. And then we're going to knit a stitch. So we're going to do that all the way across until we get to those last 3 stitches. Because I've got an even number of stitches, and I'm alternating between slipping a stitch and knitting a stitch, this last stitch right here is going to be knit, and then the next 3 are as well. Now I turn the work, and once again I work the first 3 stitches, or however many you have decided to keep in garter stitch, 1, 2, 3, however many. So work those first 3 stitches as knits, and then I purl until I get to the last 3 stitches. And then you knit the last 3 stitches. So we're going to repeat these 2 rows until our heel flap is long enough. So there are a couple of ways that you can decide how long you're going to make your heel flap. There is a formula that many people use, which is however many stitches you are using for the heel flap, that's how many rows you want to work for your heel flap. Because we're working in the slip stitch pattern, you will see 1 slip stitch for every 2 rows that we actually work, because we're only working that stitch on the purl rows. On the knit rows, we're slipping it. So you can count those elongated slip stitches and know how many that you have. So if I have 32 stitches on my needle and I want 32 rows, I need to have 16 slip stitches down the heel flap. Now, I have fit issues at the heel, and that is not going to create a heel flap that's long enough for me personally. So I tend to knit a heel flap that's longer. I have a video that explains how you can determine how long you need your heel flap to be, which I will link to above and down below. But for this sample, we're going to follow that formula so that we will have 32 rows altogether. The last row that we work is going to be a knit row, and then we will be ready to do the heel turn. Okay, I have finished my heel flap, and because row 1 of the heel flap started with the garter stitch, we get purl bumps on this side, and the first slip stitch row was on row 2. By the time we get all of these done and we finish with a right side row, you will see I have 16 ridges of garter stitch, and I have 15 slip stitch rows below the needle, and that's because the last row I worked were slip stitches, and until I work another purl row, those aren't going to come off of the needle. So you will have 1 less slip stitch than you have garter ridges. Ultimately, you're going to end up with 1 more garter ridge on this edge than you have on that edge. Now we're going to work the heel turn, and we're going to start it with a purl row. Oftentimes we start our heel turns on a right side row. For this, we're going to start on a wrong side row. It's a regular round heel turn that you're probably very familiar with. I'm going to mark the center of the heel because I think that can be easier. So I have 32 stitches. I'm going to mark where the center point is. So 16 stitches in, I'm going to place a marker. Turn the work, and we are going to work 2 stitches past the center, then we're going to work a decrease, and then we're going to work a single stitch after that. So we're going to start the row though, continuing with this garter stitch ridge that we have. So I'm getting to the center. I've hit my marker, let that fly off, and I need to work 2 more stitches. Then I work my decrease. So the decrease I'm going to work is a purl 2 together, and then a regular purl stitch. So regardless of how many stitches you have on your needle for the heel, you work 2 stitches past the center. Now on the right side row, we're going to slip that first stitch as if to purl, and then we're going to knit 5 stitches. And again, that's true regardless of how many stitches you started with. Now we do a decrease here. This time we're going to do a left leaning decrease. I'm going to do an SSK. You can do slip 1, knit 1, pass slip stitch over if you prefer. So I've done my decrease, and now I knit my extra stitch. So this should be familiar to you if you've ever done any kind of round heel turn. We're going to continue turning, slipping the first stitch, and then we're going to work 1 stitch more than we did on the previous row. So we had knit 6, so now we're going to purl 7. Or we'd knit 5, we're going to purl 6. And when we do that, we see that we have a gap right here between these 2 stitches. This is where we had turned before. So we want to eliminate that gap by working these 2 stitches together. And then we work our single stitch after that. So we don't really need to count anymore. We can just know that we slip the first stitch, and then we knit until we get to where that gap is, 1 stitch before the gap. And it should be pretty obvious where that gap is. So I've got one stitch before the gap, and then I've got a bunch of stitches after. So I'm going to do my left leaning decrease. So slip 2 stitches as if to knit, and then work them together. And then you always work a stitch after you work your decrease. So I'm going to continue this until I work a row where I am going across every one of those stitches, and then the heel turn will be complete. So I'm about to do the very last row of the heel turn, and because I'm using magic loop, I am actually going to work this last row on a double pointed needle. If you're already working on double pointed needles, then you're good to go. Because there's a specific thing that we have to do after we work this last row. So we slip this stitch, we work across like we have always. And then I'm going to work those final 2 stitches together. And depending on how many stitches you started with, you may or may not have an extra stitch to, available to work after your final decrease, and that was the case for me. So now that I have finished working the heel, I actually want to cut this yarn. So I want to cut it and leave a long enough tail that I can weave it in. So 4 to 6 inches, something like that. So I'm going to cut the yarn. And now I need to go back to the beginning of this needle here, and I want to work across all of those stitches again, but I want to do that using a contrast color. Something smooth would be really helpful, not something too fuzzy, because this is marking where the end of the heel is, so that when you go to replace it later, you know where that is. So we're going to join the yarn and we're going to work across all of those stitches. So now we can cut this yarn as well, again, leaving a long enough tail that you can weave it in, so 4 to 6 inches, something like that. So this is the point where we are going to resume working in the round for a sock. And normally what that would mean for heel flap and gusset construction is that you would pick stitches up along the edge here, knit across the instep, pick up stitches along the other edge, and then you could work across the heel turn stitches and you'd be working in the round. But because we want to set this up to be replaceable, what we're going to do instead is cast on stitches. So if we look at this heel that was worked using the technique I'm showing you, you can see where this contrast yarn is right here. That was used to actually sew the edges together. So what we're going to do is cast on an edge here and then work across the instep, cast on another edge, and then work across the heel stitches. And that's going to bring us back to working in the round. And then there will be a gap between the heel flap and the stitches that are creating the gusset that we will close later with the contrast yarn. So the cast on method I'm going to use is the backwards loop cast on, because it's going to not be bulky at all. It's going to lie really flat on the inside. And I'm going to pick up that main yarn that we just cut and start casting on there. And it's important, even though these 2 tails are going to be in the same place, it's important that you cut the yarn, because it will be really difficult to rip back that heel if you are using the same yarn you used to create the heel turn, if you then use it to create the cast on. Because when you remove the heel, you still want there to be yarn tails existing in the fabric. So we're going to give ourselves a tail, and then we can cast on 16, I need to cast on 16 stitches, but however many stitches you would have picked up, that's how many you will need to have along your cast on edge. I need 16. I'm going to cast on a few less than that, and then I'll make up the difference on the next round because it can be tricky to manage the tension in this kind of a cast on method. And I'll show you what I mean. 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, I have 13. So I need 16, but I've cast on 13, and I'll make up those extra 3 on the following round. But again, you can cast on the actual number that you need. I've got my cast on stitches for the side of the flap. Now I'm going to work across my instep. Again, I need to cast on the number of stitches I need for the flap. And again, I'm going to cast on a couple fewer than that and then make up for them on the next round. So now we're going to work halfway across the heel stitches. I have 18 right now, so I'm going to work across 9. Now we have come to the end of the round. This is establishing working in the round again. If you're dividing up between 2 circulars on magic loop, on double pointed needles, however you want to do it, this will be the beginning of the round. So the next round, you're just going to work plain, no decreases for gussets yet. You're just going to work plain. So now I'm going to be working across my cast on stitches, and I'm going to be adding 3 as I go using make 1 increases. I have 13 and I need 16, so I'm going to work 4 and then do a make 1, work 4, do a make 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I've got this gap here, so I can lift this up just like a make 1 and work it through the back so that it twists. Now we've got 5, so I'm going to work 4 more. Add another one. Now I've got 10. So, and I've got 5 remaining. And I'm going to add my last one in that gap between those right there. So I've got my 16 along my cast on edge now. So I've got all of the ones that I actually need. Now I can work across the instep, and I can do the same thing on the other cast on edge where I'm adding a few more. If you want to see a more complete video on this technique, I will leave one down below. Again, you could just cast on the number that you need. Instead, you could probably even use knitting on as a cast on method if you wanted. That would probably work as well, because that would be fairly unbumpy in terms of being a cast on edge. Okay, so I finished that round, that first plain round after the cast on round, and what you can see is you've got the leg here, you've got this heel flap and heel turn. This is the part that's going to be replaceable, and you've got it separated from the rest of the foot with this contrast yarn here. And we've got a cast on edge here, so this is separated from the heel flap that can be replaced later. And what you're going to do from now going forward is work this like a regular gusset. So you will do your decreases every other round until you're back down to the number of stitches that you need for your sock foot, and then you will knit the foot plain, and then you will do your sock toe. And the other thing that you can do at the toe is, if you are doing a wedge toe, is that you can graft it using contrast yarn as well. So that the idea with the replaceability is that you can see where that graft is, and it would allow you to take that out and then easily grip back the toe if the toe was an issue. But if the rest of the foot is absolutely fine, then you can leave it as is and you come back to the heel and you take the heel out and rip that back. So that's the beauty of this, is like if the foot is absolutely fine, but you need to replace the toe or the heel, you can do that. So now it's time to join the edge of the heel flap to the edge of the gusset. And we're going to be using a really flat seaming method. Having a garter stitch at the edge means that we can join these two edges together and get a really flat result. Now I chose to work 3 garter stitches at each edge. And that's because when you have a single garter stitch next to that first slip stitch at the edge, the yarn will pull and make that garter bump a little bit smaller than the other side. And these are already really small, tiny stitches. And so for me, it's just easier to pick up a garter bump if I've got a couple of other just regular stitches next to it, rather than having a slip stitch next to it. So, but that's the reason for the garter stitch. Even the single one is for the flat stitch. The additional garter stitches are because it helps me make that selvage stitch a little easier to pick up. So what you're going to have on one side is, like, I had 16 cast on stitches and I worked my heel flap so that I had 16 garter bumps. I ended up with 1 extra garter bump on this edge when I started the heel turn. So I actually have 17 on this side, but the other side I do have 16 and 16. So what we want to do is we want to join one of the stitches at the cast on edge. And so we look at the twisted loop, we can see that this is the yarn tail where that first stitch was. And right above it, we can see the V of a knit stitch. And we want to wrap around there when we're grabbing from this edge. When we grab from this edge, we want to grab one of the garter bumps. So there's a trio of bumps. On this left edge, you can see there's 2 bumps down here, and then there's 1 larger one there. So that's kind of at the lower end. We have 1 extra garter bump than we have stitches. So I want to start the seam with a garter bump, and then I'll end with a garter bump so that we can use all of them up. So you want to go through that kind of central bump right there to catch, just to catch that bump. Pull your yarn through. You're going to leave a tail for weaving in later. And then over on this side, you can see where the yarn tail is, where it starts. We're going to come behind both legs of the knit stitch that's above that cast on edge. So we're going to come around like this. We don't have to worry yet about making it super tight. And then once again, we're going to grab one of those garter bumps and then come back to this edge and come around both legs of the V of the stitch that's right above that twisted leg or twisted edge. So I'm not worried right now about making this super tight. I'm just I can always make it tighter later. If I make it too tight, that can sometimes make it harder to see what I'm doing. So these are small bumps, and sometimes it can be hard to see what you're doing. Once again, I come around both legs of that stitch. And then I come back to the edge and I grab the next garter bump. And I'm going to do that all the way up until I've used up all of the stitches and all of the bumps. And then I will repeat it on the other side. Now, if you find it hard, like if you're seaming these up and you're finding, oh, you're off, like you end up with more stitches on one half than the other, that you're off, and it could be that you're catching the same garter bump multiple times. What you can do is use a double pointed needle and thread those bumps all along a double pointed needle before you start seaming. And so then you know, okay, I'm going to grab this one and let it off the needle, and then I'll go get my cast on stitch on this side. And you can do it that way if that makes it easier. It does make it easier for me sometimes if the yarn's really fuzzy or really dark. It might just be really hard to see as you're going, and you want to just confirm that you know where all of the stitches are, and you can start out that way. Now you can adjust the tension of your seamed stitches later. You can always pull some slack out. You can tighten things up a little bit. You do want to be able to still see it, because when you want to take this out later, you need to know where those stitches are. But that's what this looks like when it's completed. Now, when it's time to weave in all your ends, I would suggest that any yarn tail associated with the heel get woven into the backs of the stitches in the heel or the heel flap. And any tails associated with this part of the sock get woven in on this half. And that's because when you take this apart, you don't want a yarn tail from this half being woven in over here and getting cut, and then these stitches not being secured. So you want to make sure that you keep those on either side. And then the contrast yarn, you can really weave in anywhere you want. You might even want to weave them in along the contrast yarn itself, so that when you're taking it out, you're not having to try to take a yellow yarn tail out of somewhere and try to get that out. That might be the simplest thing. This sock is showing an alternative to the method where we cast on for that edge and then seamed it together. Instead of casting on with the main yarn along the edges of the gusset, stitches were picked up kind of like you normally do, only into this garter edge. Stitches were picked up using the contrast yarn. And the idea is that when it's time to take it out, you will be capturing live stitches on all of the edges around next to this contrast yarn. After you replace the heel, you would then have to join this heel to this half, or to the gusset, and you'd have to do that by using a hybrid of seaming and grafting. So that is an alternative to this method. This whole concept of this replaceable heel and heel flap was created by a woman. She was a lieutenant in the Canadian military, a Wren, during World War II, and that is when she patented this concept. This was an era of rationing and make do and mend. It was an era before nylon content in socks, and so durability wasn't what you can get with sock yarns today. Her patent, the concept for her patent, was purchased by Paytons and Baldwin, who also had yarn lines called Beehive. And it explained the different methods that you could use in this. So you can find patents that date back to the 1940s for this sock in Canada, the US, and in Great Britain. I will leave links down below to this booklet. Explains the initial concept in a 2-page spread. None of the socks in this book call for this particular heel. They just explain that it can be done. In this sock book, all of the socks in this book have these replaceable heels, and you can see the contrast yarn here. In this book, they describe the Aladdin heel, and they only describe the version that has the cast on. This is considered the preferred method, and I think it's because you don't risk live stitches when you're taking that heel apart and then have to join them in a different way than you did when you originally knit the sock. But it's really up to you as a knitter what method you would prefer to use. In the next Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate the process of removing and replacing the heel. I have many videos for sock knitters on my channel. You can find the full playlist right here. I also have a written tutorial on how to knit custom fit socks, particularly for people with fit issues who find the standard formulas and instructions just don't work for them. I'll leave a link to that tutorial down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.